So I've created a Avalara training org within our platform, but effectively the core kind of platform makeup is integrations. So you can think of these as separate projects that you might build. So if you're building an integration between Square and Avalara, for example, so that would be one individual integration or project. Focusing on today, so planning agent and connecting are going to be the two kind of modules that we're going to focus on, just because this kind of provides the foundations for how a project would typically start. So I'm just going to go straight into the planning agent. So starting off with things, this is how a new project would look. So ahead of the call, I've wrote a prompt out. So copy this one. Cool. So from this prompt, there's a kind of everything that we put into the planning agent, as much detail as possible is the best approach. But trying to think of this in a sequential kind of process. So, for example, I've said that I want an event-driven workflow that is integrating Square draft invoices with Avalara Avatax for real-time tax estimation. So then I've gone into authentication and how I want each system to authenticate, and then almost like a user story based prompt for what I want the integration to achieve. So when a draft invoice is created or updated, the workflow should retrieve the full invoice details from Square, customer data, billing, shipping information, etc., and ensure that the customer addresses are available for tax calculation. Once we have that, the workflow should send this data to Avalara and as a sales invoice estimate using the create transaction endpoint. So what I'm trying to kind of communicate with this is it's fine to kind of input some of your own knowledge into this and try and guide it down the right path. The benefit of doing that is that it will kind of create the correct foundation for the rest of the integration. However, having said that, I'll send this in a second, but we can iterate back and forth with this step to get it to an ideal perspective. So even if it kind of AI, as you guys will know, it does sometimes go off on the wrong path and you kind of need to reprompt it back into the right kind of guidelines. So that can happen, but we can iteratively extend on these documents that will be created. So just towards the end of this as well, down at the bottom, I've included some documentation references. The agent is able to go and retrieve these pages and kind of understand exactly which endpoints it needs to use from these documentation pages. So it's always good practice to just include a few links at the bottom. You can include PDFs if needed, or any kind of Word documents just for documentation. And yeah, again, as much information at this step as possible is beneficial. So if I just go ahead and send that. So now that I've submitted my brief, you can think of this as a brief for an integration. The planning agent is going to go away and research the topic as a kind of talking point. So it's effectively going to go and open all of the documentation links. It's going to plan out the integration and think about any kind of nuances it needs to sort as and when it crops up in its thought process. So the result that we will end up with from this is going to be a technical implementation document. So when that gets generated, we can effectively review the technical implementation. We can see it's creating connectors for us, which we'll touch on later. It's doing web research now in terms of how it needs to actually fulfill these endpoints and figure out how to actually achieve this programmatically. And it will kind of include citations as we kind of move through this, so you can fact check what it's actually doing. So if I click on sources, for example, here are all the kind of searches that it's gone through while trying to investigate. So we can see, for example, it's access to Python SDK from GitHub, Avalara documentation directly, and similarly, we'll have some links for the Square POS system as well as this moves through. Once we've kind of got through and generated the research document, so it's at a good point then where we can review and kind of assess the approach. If there's anything in that we want to kind of consider, or we've got additional context to, maybe, you know, there's a new API that is better suited for this approach on your side, we can simply just reprompt and say to regenerate the research document with the following information. So yeah, effectively, like I said, the key kind of input with this is provide as much documentation and kind of business logic information as possible. And what we end up with, I'm just going to skip through to my other version of this because effectively I've already run this through in the module 2. So what we end up with for the plan is my initial prompt, and then it kind of creates a summary of what we're trying to achieve. Now, if I open up the research document, so this just gives a summary of the integration. It breaks down actual environment specifics. So, for example, the different URLs within Square, for example, it's sandbox systems, anything around versioning, for example, as part of the URL, authentication methods. So Square uses OAuth 2, and it's identified that we need to kind of require a client ID, client secret for that. Things like refreshing tokens through the OAuth flow, and just kind of general high-level technical documentation. As we kind of step through this, documenting the different types of webhook events that we need to listen to achieve this piece, and just any other kind of payload information, transformations, retry functionality, static IPs. This isn't necessarily needed. I think that's just kind of preempting that as a possibility because it's quite common in a lot of the integrations that we do build. And then it's just honing in on specific kind of endpoints that it envisions using. So yeah, in a normal integration, you will review this. Maybe you see something you want to change, you reprompt and update that section, and it's kind of an iterative cycle of getting to a point where you're happy with the approach. When we've kind of gone through that step and generated the research document, what we end up with is workflows. So effectively, the first workflow that is now generated, so if I expand this, so this is, rather than it being technical documentation, it's now focused more on how we're actually going to prompt the build agent and the information it needs to build a sequential workflow. That's not to say that when we get to the build agent, so the build agent has full context over all of the research, all of the input that we've given it, and as well as the kind of the workflow documentations itself. The only difference with this approach is effectively we define more around user stories and acceptance criteria. This is more the kind of business requirements document rather than it being a technical document. So we tried to keep all of the integrations building kind of business requirements first and expanding on that with the technical requirements. So I did a bit of upfront work on this as kind of preparation. I think, like I said, you can go very minimal with this first step. You might well have just said, design an event-driven workflow that integrates Square draft invoices with Avalara avatars. That might have been your whole prompt. If you start off so minimal, it will go and do the additional research and try and identify these endpoints. But going one step further than that, if you want to kind of get off to a quicker start and you already have this knowledge, because obviously, in this case, it's your system, you understand it. I think the more input you give it that step, the better the results will be. It's just the key kind of differentiation is the more you put in, the more you get back. So, like I was saying, you can get to 90% accuracy out the door if you just put in a little bit more input up front rather than kind of a simple prompt. So it all depends. If you don't have the knowledge and you need it to do a bit of research for you, then that's fine. It's just if you do have additional knowledge, you're better inputting it. So if you do prompt a little bit too much, it will come back with clarifying questions such as, if multiple authentication methods exist, which one do you want to use? If there's multiple versions of an API that you might not have defined which one you want to use, it will ask you which version of an API you want to use. It's designed to kind of challenge you effectively if it isn't confident in what you've given it. Obviously, in this case, I've done a bit of upfront kind of preparation to make sure that that doesn't happen. But yeah, the idea is when you guys get your hands on this and play around with it, it would be good for you to try out a varying approach with lots of input up front and then minimal input up front just to see the difference. My kind of time in the platform, I spend more time in this section than I do anywhere, because I might sit here for 3-4 hours at any given time and kind of just make sure that these documentation steps are 100% accurate. But again, sometimes, it gets it right first try, and you don't need to do that. It's at this point, like I said, you would typically reprompt, and I did that with this particular approach. Obviously, I've designed it in this way, but effectively, when I then went through and generated the first workflow, I got to thinking on this as an actual production integration. And it's all well and good if we have an integration that's waiting for a webhook to be received. But how do we actually, when this is a multi-tenanted integration that is available in a marketplace, how do we reduce the required input for a user to actually get this integration working? So I then reprompted with the fact that I actually want it to manage webhooks for me as well. So they get provisioned automatically. So the second prompt that I've given this is to create a second workflow, which will go in, essentially ensure that the webhooks exist in Square for me, and just make sure that, there's no kind of manual input needed by the user. So another workflow is generated here. Again, it's honing in on the 2 different events that are needed. So again, I can expand this out, assess the approach it's going to take, and go from there. So again, this piece is best experienced by yourselves in the kind of interactive step of this kind of training session, which we'll get to shortly. But yeah, it's back and forth iteration is the main kind of point with that.